Welcome to the Thursday, May 11th History Bites lecture, sponsored by the Amherst Historical Society. My name is George Naughton, and today we welcome Sandra Mathews and David Brule, who will talk about their book, Occupying Massachusetts. The book's photographs and captions give the reader a sense of the continuing presence of the past and the evanescence of the present moment. As they quote Christine de Lucia's statement in her book, Memory Lands, a place never belongs to one group. There are always multiple claimants, passers through, and understandings of the same physical setting. So, take it away, Sandra and David.
All right. Thank you so much, George. And thank you, those of you who are here taking time out from a beautiful spring day to sit in front of your computers. We appreciate your presence. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about the new photo book, Occupying Massachusetts, Layers of History on Indigenous Land. And I'm especially honored to present alongside David Brule, who's doing inspired work to protect Indigenous histories and to support contemporary Indigenous cultures in the Connecticut River Valley. David will start us off with a land acknowledgement. Then I will show slides for about 15 minutes and talk to you in relation to the slides. And then David will speak about his important work. And then we hope to have a few minutes left for questions if you all would like to chat afterwards. So David.
Well, thank you. I could almost say good morning, but it's a little bit after the early afternoon on a beautiful day. So some of you must be familiar with, do we have some feedback? Is it me or is it somewhere else? Okay, some of you, I was about to say, some of you must be familiar with the concept of land acknowledgement, and it's gone through a lot of iterations from even in the last 5 years. So people have proposed any range of thoughts about acknowledging the first peoples who lived here. I'll use a very simple one that I wrote for a number of communities. There is also, if you are in the vicinity of Leverett, I assisted with the committee in Leverett to develop a land acknowledgement. I worked closely with Tom Wolfe. This is a fundamental acknowledgement that we are standing on Indigenous land. For thousands of years, this has been the homelands of the Pocumtucks. This is still the homelands of the Pocumtuck. They are still here. Their voices are still here in the air we breathe. They are not gone. The Pocumtuck shared this landscape with many extended communities with whom they were likely related, including the Nanotucks and Norwatucks, the Warrenoko, the Agawam, even as far down as the Tunxis in near the Farmington River, all the way down through the valley. They're all connected. But the Pocumtuck more or less were the provided the essential tribal leadership. Some have even referred to a Pocumtuck Federation. So all of that is depending on who you read and what you retain. But the point is that the Pocumtuck are still here. They're in the landscape. They're in the air that we breathe. This is still, in modern times, a place where the three nations of the Nipmuc, the Abenaki, and the Pocumtuck join in very fluid coexistence. We give thanks to those first people and acknowledge that we are standing on and benefiting from land that is theirs still, and in many circumstances has been taken from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm speaking to you here today as an occupant and occupier of Massachusetts. Oh, I'm going to first share the screen. Can everyone see the slides? Okay. All right. This book began in 2015 when I took a tour of a historic house in eastern Massachusetts. The tour guide spoke at length about the importance of this house in the American Revolution and mentioned in passing that it was located on an old Indian trail. I asked for more information, but the guide dismissed the question and said that nothing was known. Yet we do know that Indigenous people have lived in this area for more than 13,000 years, and that there are currently nearly 100,000 people of Indigenous descent living in Massachusetts. But from the vantage point of this historic house, it seemed that American history started with the arrival of English colonists, and whatever came before had been rendered invisible. This experience got me thinking, as a photographer, about the visual presence of Indigenous history in the landscape. Of course, visual presence is only one way that history is registered. We regularly use place names derived from Indigenous languages, such as the name Massachusetts, and Indigenous people keep stories and customs alive. But what visual evidence of Indigenous history could I find with my camera in the midst of all the structures that have been built on this land over the past 400 years? Through early conversations with David Brule, with Doug Harris, and with others, I began to learn about the ceremonial stone sites, which can be found all over the state on private and public lands. Their specific locations are sometimes concealed for the protection of these sites, for their own protection. So this was the location of this one was concealed. This one is out in public space in a public park, but with no signage. When I was there in 2019, no indication of what it was, or it was just there in a public park. You could walk in, duck your head, and walk through this tunnel, stand up in a spherical chamber inside, turn around and look back out the entrance, and be aligned with the solstice. It's an amazing place. Other sites are buried underground. This one near my home in Northampton was discovered in 2020 when a traffic circle was planned by the city and state archaeologists were required to investigate. Evidence was found of an 8,000-year-old Indigenous settlement, complete with tools and artifacts. It's all covered over again now. In addition to ancient sites, the continuity of Indigenous presence can also be felt in the contemporary construction of traditional dwellings, such as this Wampanoag Witu. Covered in bark, it carries on centuries-old practices. This Witu was built by Indigenous people for demonstrations at the Plymouth Patuxet Museums, but others can be found on tribal lands. Here you can see smoke coming from an indoor cooking fire. Here you can see the armature of a smaller Witu and the benches around the perimeter that would be covered with very comfortable soft fur. While I was encountering Indigenous structures and photographing them, I was also traveling around the state photographing other kinds of vernacular architecture, all of it built, of course, on what was originally Indigenous land. Many of the structures I photographed were small scale, modeling the ways that people try to create safe, sheltering spaces, even though we know that no human structures are really permanent. Human settlement, in all its diversity, its fleetingness, and the stories that are told about human settlement, these are the underlying themes of the book, human settlement and the stories that are told about it. There are many stories to be told about the settlement or occupation of Massachusetts. People from all over the world have settled here from the beginning. Enslaved Africans were brought to the state as early as the 1630s. This is an African American church here in Amherst, built in 1910 to house a congregation which first came together as a congregation in 1825. The church continues to be home to a thriving congregation. The enslavement of both African and Indigenous people was legal in the Massachusetts Bay Colony for the first 150 years plus of the colony's existence. It was outlawed in 1783. This leads me to say a few words about the importance of Christianity, the complex place of Christianity in the establishment of Massachusetts. Going back to the 15th century papal bull and the doctrine of discovery, these decrees provided religious and political justification for the takeover by Christians of all uninhabited lands, meaning lands inhabited by non-Christians. The doctrine of discovery was only just officially repudiated by the Vatican this past March. Yet, in spite of these Christian decrees providing a rationale and legal support for racially based subjugation and the conquest of land, many Black and Indigenous people converted to Christianity here in Massachusetts in the 1600s. Natick, founded in 1651, was the first of several praying Indian towns, part of a movement to build English-style villages for Native people who had converted or were converting to Christianity. Although this community was interned on Deer Island by the English during King Philip's War, and most of its members perished there, there's still a contemporary branch of the Massachusetts people who call themselves the Natick Praying Indians and worship at the Eliot Church across the street from this site. The Eliot Church is the updated version of the original meeting house built by Native people together with the missionary John Eliot in 1652. The fence you see here with interspersed crosses and arrows was added in the 19th century. Although Christianity was central to the founding of Massachusetts, many other kinds of people have played important roles from the start. The first Jews came to Massachusetts in the 1600s, although the first synagogue was not built until 1850. This is a backyard sukkah, a temporary dwelling built for the fall harvest holiday of Sukkot, appropriate for this project because it's intended to remind us of the tenuousness of human settlement. More recently, Cambodians arrived in Amherst and other regions of Massachusetts in the late 1970s and 1980s, and I understand that the Amherst Historical Society will be doing some special events around the stories of this immigration and community. Here, the lions guard the path to an enormous statue of the Buddha on the grounds of the Cambodian temple, which is in Leverett next to the Peace Pagoda. Maybe you've been there. These are a few examples among many layers of history here in Massachusetts. There are multiple powerful stories to tell, including stories of other dispossessions and injustices which took place here long after the original occupation of Indigenous land. Layers of history. When my own parents immigrated to the US in the aftermath of World War II, they had no concept of Indigenous land. They were just grateful to be in a place where they felt safer than where they had been. But to the extent that this country can offer a haven to people from elsewhere, that offer is tragically always built upon the foundational violent displacement of Indigenous peoples, which began in the 1600s. The effects of this displacement are still with us. In addition to photographs of structures made by Indigenous people and by others, as you've just seen, the book contains also photographs of historical markers and these markers talk about early encounters between English and Indigenous people. The markers were made at different times by different people with different political intentions. They provide the main text of the book, another way of looking at layers of history, and I'd like to show you a few of these markers. This one, which reads, I don't know if you can see the text clearly, it reads, Indian region called Quascaconquin, settled 1635 under leadership of the Puritan clergyman Thomas Parker. It's part of a series of 275 cast iron signs installed throughout the state in 1930 to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the founding in 1630 of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You've probably seen these signs. They're sprinkled all over the state, and there are quite a few of them in our area here. The Massachusetts Bay Colony Tercentenary Commission, which is the group that commissioned these signs, hired Harvard history professor Samuel Eliot Morrison to write the texts on the signs. Some of those texts, such as this one, are useful and informative, Others are problematic, and it really would be great if their language was updated or at least recontextualized. The signs were originally intended to inspire patriotism, and in a quote from a book about the signs published in 1930, they were intended to, quote, rekindle in us a veneration for the pioneers of a new country. Interestingly, when the state decided to refurbish a number of these signs, which are getting quite rusty, at taxpayer expense 4 years ago in 2019, the Department of Transportation chose to leave everything intact, including the text as they were, no new context, and the state seal, which is on every single one of these signs, was refurbished and made to really glow in its full blue and gold, although we hope it's going to be changed very soon. So no additional context has been added. They've been refurbished just 4 years ago as they were. Changing public history seems to be complicated and difficult, but some people are trying to do it. This marker, installed by the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association in 1900, it is in the process of being recontextualized, we hope. The text of the marker reads, Captain William Turner, with 145 men, surprised and destroyed over 300 Indians and camped at this place. With its disturbing language, the marker has been a site of frequent protest over the years. You can see traces of red spray paint in this photo. The Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association is in conversation with the Nolambika Project about providing an alternative text or artwork alongside the marker, informed by indigenous perspectives. The marker itself would be left as is, but recontextualized by this additional material. It's a very interesting and important project. And there are a few markers that were made from a Native point of view in the first place. This marker, which appears in the book, was installed in 1998 by the United American Indians of New England in collaboration with the town of Plymouth. It's called National Day of Mourning, and it reads, since 1970, Native Americans have gathered at noon on Coles Hill in Plymouth to commemorate a National Day of Mourning on the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday. Many Native Americans do not celebrate the arrival of the Pilgrims and other European settlers. To them, Thanksgiving is a reminder of the genocide of millions of their people, the theft of their lands, and the relentless assault on their culture. Participants in National Day of Mourning honor Native ancestors and the struggles of Native people today. It's a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest of the racism and oppression which Native Americans continue to experience. So that marker was installed in 1998 at the top of a hill just above Plymouth Rock, the mythical landing place of the Pilgrims. So it offers an alternative narrative to the more traditional story of settler heroism. The Day of Mourning itself continues to be a vibrant gathering that takes place each November. Perhaps some of you have been or plan to go this year. Thinking then about changing narratives, this book uses place names to try to create a shift in consciousness. The caption of every photo identifies its indigenous homeland, and wherever possible, original indigenous place names are added to the names in current use. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the indigenous name for the area in which the town of Amherst was built. It would be great to have an alternative to using the name of a British commander who supported extirpating, that's his word, according to his letters, extirpating indigenous people by any means possible. I'd like to end with an Amherst-based story about the complexity of place names. Here you see Mount Norwottuck in the distance and also represented on the side of this farm building. In the mid-1880s, it was called Hilliard's Knob, and Edward Hitchcock, the famous geologist who was then president of Amherst College, renamed it Mount Norwottuck, using the Algonquian name for the nearby area. I don't know what his intentions were in renaming the mountain, but he probably was not aware that, according to Indigenous researcher Marge Bruchac, the word Norwottuck means something like the middle of the river, which is an odd name for the highest peak in the area. So, in sum, I'm trying to show that through old and new structures, through old and new historical markers, through old and new names, we can see that the fashioning of history is a changing conversation over time, the conversation in which many can participate. Working on this book has deepened my engagement with the place in which I live and has given me an opportunity to meet remarkable people like David Brule. David has written a beautiful essay in the book and was a sage advisor throughout the project, and I'll turn it now over to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sandra. I want to reintroduce myself. I'm David, David Brule. I worked in the Amherst region for so long in the high school. I taught almost 40 years at both what was called then the junior high school and then I moved to the high school. I was a teacher of foreign languages. I may have had some of your children, or we crossed paths at some point. When I retired, I basically changed my focus to working with indigenous groups in the area. So I really want to thank Sandra, because one of the interesting perspectives for me was to think about the title of her book, which is Occupying Massachusetts. And we all knew that the homelands of the local tribal people often was taken by violent means or trickery. However, the thought that it is still occupied, using occupying as a qualifier, I think finding it very, very interesting to turn that whole perspective around a little bit. I took it further in a couple of the talks I gave in various places, churches and elsewhere, and I used the term occupied Massachusetts. Looking back, I mean, one of my own personal experiences through relatives in Europe are the memories of occupied France, other countries that were occupied, and that carries a whole lot of feeling. It's even nowadays, even after that particular occupation of the last World War, those feelings still run very deep. And so you can imagine the indigenous people of the area considering this state, modern day state, or this whole territory of the Northeast being continually occupied. So that changes, at least it changed for me, my perspective, and led me down a different path in terms of speaking about this land. And Sandra invited me to write an essay for it, and that was very Again, it helped me refocus a little bit of my various talks. In that essay, I mentioned that the fact of this being occupied land for indigenous people, it can never be forgotten. It can't be undone or erased in the minds of Native people. How can you ever erase the site of the current devastation this continuing colonization process is still bringing upon the land? So that said, one of the issues, of course, is that this occupation will never end. There's no way it's going to go back to what it was. But we indigenous peoples still carry that multi-generational trauma. So how do you find a way forward? How can there be real reconciliation and healing? Given the occupation of modern day Massachusetts will never end, and the wounds that people carry, indigenous people carry, are deep and may never be healed. So I'm not a pessimistic person. So what do we do? How do we find a way forward? Well, one of the things I started this brief interlude with was a land acknowledgement, which I think is an incredible first step of admitting that things went terribly wrong a couple of centuries ago, and that wrong is still ongoing. On the other hand, by acknowledging that fact, it's contributing to the beginning of a hint of a beginning of healing for people, but it'll be really challenging. One of the things that Sandra wanted me to write about is an experience that I've been living for the last 10 years. One, finding my own indigenous roots that 20 years ago finally were revealed. I went on teaching in Amherst, considering myself, like my mother told me, a person of French and Irish descent. The family buried all of our connections with indigenous and African American people, probably out of self-preservation, but nevertheless, it deprived me of knowing a whole lot about the whole other richly textured side of my family that was, well, for all intents and purposes, erased. So when along came Ancestry.com and genealogical research and DNA testing, all of that fiction was blown sky high. And I began reconnecting both with the my kin, people that I was not allowed to know were my cousins, second, third cousins. And they didn't live too far from me. Some lived in Amherst. Some lived in Leverett. Some lived in Greenfield. So I reconnected with them. And through the genealogical research, I was able to trace my own people back as far back as 1695 to the wars just after the period right after King Philip's War. So I got involved in various organizations, one being the Nolambika Project that I am now chairman of. The Nolambika Project basically is a non-tribal organization that serves as a go-between between tribal and non-tribal people by offering a number of events during the year that provide an opportunity for people to meet the tribal people who have stayed below the radar in our region for good reason. So that is one of the things that I undertook. Something going back to my own rhetorical question is how do we find a way forward? Well, one way is to just learn about, acknowledge, respect, validate the existence of these people who have kept under the radar for a lot of reasons. The Nipmuc and the Abenaki people are among us. Many of them still attend powwows or have their own cultural gatherings, their own tribal councils. A lot of us have met those people through the events that the Nolambika Project has sponsored. The other thing that I think captured the imagination of Sandra, and which is something I've just been doing because I've been doing it for so long, is interestingly a study of the horrific massacre that happened at the falls, now known as Turner's Falls, at the end of King Philip's War in 1676. And actually the anniversary is coming up this week. We will be holding a day of remembrance for the victims of that massacre that occurred on May 19th. So we'll be holding our vigil and ceremony of remembrance on May 20th at the Discovery Center at the falls, overlooking the site where bodies washed up after having gone over the falls that some we call Peskiomscut, meaning the place of the thundering rocks. Others called it the Deerfield Falls. The colonials called it Deerfield Falls and Great Falls, until along came a person to say, well, the valiant general of a valiant captain who died that day, he should have that place named for him. So they call it Turner's Falls. But we are working on, as Sandra said, finding perhaps a bilingual name for that place. Peskiomscut is a good name. But anyway, we, in the town of Montague, landed a grant from the National Park Service to study that horrific massacre that happened on May 19th in 1676. And for the last 10 years, we've been meeting every month at the town of Montague town hall. And the meeting is basically under the terminology of an advisory board. That the Park Service has been supporting this advisory board. We oversee, first of all, the research. We oversee we hire and oversee the work of archaeologists, and we review the discoveries or the insights or the evidence that the archaeologists turn up every Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month. The unique thing in terms of healing is that this advisory board is made up of historic commissioners from the 5 towns where the historic events happened, the approach and escape routes of the raiding forces of Captain Turner, that is Deerfield, Greenfield, Gill, Montague, and Northfield. 5 historic commissioners. Historic commissioners, unlike a historic society, exist under Massachusetts general laws and have a specific mission. And along with those 5 historical commissioners are 4 tribal historic preservation officers from the Narragansett Indian tribe, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Elnu Abenaki, and the Chabunagungamog band of Nipmuc Indians. And so the 5 commissioners and the 4 tribal representatives get together, same table, every month, and go over either the project or the advancement of the information, interpretation of the information. So that has been, Sandra came to a couple of the meetings and it still is coming. They're open to the public, but it kind of gave her a thought that I should write about that. So in the inserted into my essay is my perception of what's been going on. So if you can imagine 5 non-tribal, basically white men whose descendants, several of whose ancestors participated in that massacre in 1676. And across the table from them are 4 tribal people whose ancestors perished in that massacre. So the information and exchange has been very interesting. And we worked it out with the Park Service that these 4 tribal people would be in the field with our archaeologists that we hired and looking over their shoulders, making sure of, first of all, the correct protocols, indigenous protocols are taken into account if there are artifacts that turn up. And of course, no human remains have turned up, so that has kept things a little bit less complicated, but there's an entire legal protocol if human remains are found, and that shuts down everything. So far, they have uncovered about 600 musket balls, horse tack, buckles, personal items from that day, and have been analyzing them. The current archaeologists, Dr. Kevin McBride and David Nomak, work at are professors at the University of Connecticut. So a lot of those artifacts are at Connecticut in the lab being analyzed for lead content, origins, etc. But my point is that Sandra appreciated is that this has not been an officially declared truth and reconciliation ceremony. I think that would put reconciliation committee, that would put way too much, what would I call it, explicit pressure on people to get together and agree. So basically what's happening is that these 5 commissioners, many of whom have never met, quote unquote, real Indians in their lives, and these 4 historic preservation officers who are kind of used to working with towns, but not really. So we've been working on something, on a body of evidence and information that we can focus on instead of trying to find a way in terms of acceptance or forgiving or healing. And I think the healing is happening that way. As you know about in terms of a mediation process, having points of view validated by an opposing group is really important in terms of moving forward. So that's basically what's been going on for 10 years. So I think that struck Sandra as being quite a new experiment. It certainly is a new kind of effort to bring Indians, natives, and non-tribal people together. So that's been working really well. And we have produced all the results. There are several reports of 300 pages each that can be found on the Ton of Money website if you want to dig deeper. I'm keeping it to the bare minimum because of time constraints, but I just wanted to share that part. That yeah, that's one way that some individuals can find a way forward. Land acknowledgement is good, but what actionable items come from that? And it has been suggested, of course, to support the in Massachusetts indigenous legislative effort, the issue about changing team sports names from the using native logos or caricatures, which all of the tribes in the area support that change, to observing Indigenous Peoples Day, a number of things like that. We are all in this trying to find a way forward, given that we know we can't turn a page back. So I just wanted to share that much with you. I've just been, I see that some of the people that I have worked with over the past are present, and when you're an Amherst teacher, you just never stop. And that's my case. I have been working. I have a group meeting with students from Framingham High School in the next half hour to take them through one of the battle sites, one of the massacre sites in the burial ground where people were buried. And then, like I said, I'll be meeting up with them very shortly. So I'll draw my remarks to a close, and I think that both Sandra and I are ready to expand on whatever types of information you might want to hear further. So thank you for listening, and good to see you all. I'm very happy to see Wendy. I remember Alyssa from many years ago, and various projects in the environment, and a number of other people who are here. So thank you for listening.
I would just like to add that you talked about learning about each other and events, and to tell people if they don't know about the Pecumtuck Homelands Festival, which will happen in August. So David mentioned the memorial gathering on May 20th, which is also a great opportunity. But the first weekend of August is a weekend-long festival that brings Native people from the whole Northeast and to tell stories and sell crafts and make music, and it's really wonderful and a great way to learn if we're talking about.
Right. Yeah, I thank you, Sandra. There's so many things going on, but certainly keep that in mind. It's a 2-day music festival along the shores of the Connecticut River, right opposite the place where the massacre occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another part of the healing. We are doing this on purpose. I'll tell you, it's magical to hear these great drums of the Abenaki or the Wampanoag beating, and the sound carries up into the village of Turner's Falls and up the hills and into the woods and up towards the Montague Plains. It's a very moving experience, and it goes on, all day, 2 days, free music, free conversations and lectures. We have people from the Mohawk nations and people from as far away as the Navajo groups, and a lot of Northeast tribal representatives doing sharing their music and stories and song. We do a paddle on the Connecticut River with a Michun, which is a dugout craft that we fashioned about 2 or 3 years ago with the Wampanoags. And so the Connecticut River Conservancy assists in getting the word out, and we invite paddlers to join us. That's on a Friday just before the festival opens. So all kinds of things go on, but that's our keynote festival, big party at the falls in terms of helping that whole area to heal.
People have questions or comments, we'd welcome them.
Are there questions? Raise your hand or unmute yourself and start talking. Lisa.
Well, it's not really a question, it's just a lament that people are still fighting recognizing this history or changing the names of sports teams and things like that. I mean, it's just, well, it's distressing to me who has no direct connection to it. I can't imagine how distressing it is for people who do. It's mind-boggling, that's all.
I'm interested in either of your thoughts about organizations that want to participate in unerasure or making things visible, but feel hesitant about doing it in a way that would feel superficial or like virtue signaling, lip service. There's lots of concern for that the process should be mutual and involving parties that know more, have more at stake, but yet feeling that it's a big demand and a big project to find people with whom to work and to anyway, I feel like any comments you have about how organizations, in particular, schools and libraries and little, any event that someone might be involved in doing that want to do a greater job of acknowledging and doing more, how to do that thoughtfully. And I guess I have my own bias, which is to suggest that we not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and not feel that since we don't know how to do it all the way right, we shouldn't do anything lest we do it wrong.
Oh. Well, I felt very lucky to be able to work with David and other people who I met through those meetings that he organized. And so I think having a conversation, if you're talking about an erasure of Native histories, having a conversation with Native people is important. David, I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I can share, Allison, what you're talking about. It's really challenging. It's very hard to reach the Native Tribal Historic Preservation offices and get an answer to any questions or any effort to reach out. It's just, I think it's a question of personnel in the office. One of the main things that the tribes do is to be out in the field monitoring construction projects, because as you know, for 10,000 years, given that this is native land, I mean, wherever you turn, you're likely to be trotting on ground that has been used and visited and occupied by Native people. So one of the big jobs that these officers have is to be out all across Massachusetts. So there's not that many. Doug Harris, who is a great friend of mine and Sandra's, who has done a lot of work in the area in Amherst and Leverett, Belchertown, other places in terms of identifying ceremonial stone landscapes. He has always said there's not enough Indians to go around. And that being coming from Doug basically means there just aren't enough people to be able to respond to a lot of the requests. And a lot of it, just like any other human set of relationships or reactions, is that not all the local tribes are willing to reach out to respond. Others are wide open. Makes it very hard for people who are not tribal to, and it's even hard for tribal people because there's a lot of issues between, for example, Nipmuc communities, which are in our general vicinity, and the Abenaki group in southern Vermont, and that whose homelands reach down into Montague. It's a real challenge. I've through the battlefield study, I've personally developed some good rapport with one or two of the Nipmuc communities, and not so good with the other couple. I mean, you would think that we would be able to get together on most points, but it's challenging. So, one of the things that has made the Nolembika project so I would say respected or successful is that we play that role. We are people that if you contact, we can reach out and try to find a person in a tribal group that would respond. There's a great new Nipmuc Center in Ashfield called the Okateo Center. But as you can imagine, I mean, they're Nipmuc, basically Nipmuc, but they're overwhelmed with the requests. They don't answer their emails. They don't answer their phones. So the Nolembika project is there. We have developed credibility with the tribes across the state. So we have some way of helping. One of the things we just did this past year was produce a video for schools. And you can find it. It's free. And it's got a 50-page bibliography of places to go, contacts you can make across the country for curriculum materials. We felt that was really needed because the tribes don't have the money or the time to do this kind of thing. So basically, it's about 8 vignettes of contemporary tribal people talking about what it's like to be Native this days and age. And it's free. It's called Indigenous Voices in the Connecticut River Valley. It's on the Nolembika Project website. And some of us who have been teachers realize that in 3rd, 4th, 5th grades, you can't run a full-length 60-minute feature and still have the kids be able to get something out of it. So they're cut up into they're separate vignettes with different people, but there are as I said, a lot of contacts that you can find in the bibliography. One of the things that prompted this, one of the reasons, was that the Massachusetts curriculum frameworks requires 3rd graders to begin learning about local indigenous cultures, and then they don't tell you where to go to. So a case here either in Greenfield or Montague, the only thing they could find was something about the natives on Martha's Vineyard, which is totally not going to be helpful to 3rd graders in the Connecticut River Valley. So we produced this video. Check that out. Might give you some ideas. Otherwise, be sure to be in touch with the Nolembika Project, because we've got a lot of ways. And in my essay, that's basically what I said. How do you find a way forward, given what we know? Natives do not want people speaking for them in their stead. So you're right about the caution there. It's really hard to know. Marge Bruchak has been a great contact. She's a local person, educated at University of Massachusetts, living in Northampton, teaching at UPenn. Lisa Brooks, you might know of, who has written incredible work, lives in Leverett. She's a person more than likely in great demand, but there are local people who are incredible resources and actual go-betweens between some of the more difficult Native groups to reach. And it's not everybody who can tell the story. It's not everybody who feels comfortable talking. Same is true of Native people as for anybody else. So the frustration is there, what to do. And my point in my essay is, you've got to start small, where each of us are going to find a separate piece, a way to move forward. And on an organizational level, that's challenging. But as individuals, there's a lot we can do. It's a long answer, but it's very frustrating for everybody involved. So, and it's just human
I
nature.
appreciate it. And I appreciate the book. I think having tangible visual forms of, anyway, I think it's a great example of start with something. And so
Thank you.
Yes, and if there are no other questions, we are coming up on the 1 hour mark here. I'll go to gallery view, but thank you very much for your presentation. I'm impressed with the impulse to see land acknowledgements as only a first step, and the idea of finding a way forward rather than trying to go back to something. And the Amherst History Society, history and story are the same word. So we're looking to collect these stories and tell these stories as we find them. So I don't see any other questions. So thank you both for your presentation and for your book. And thank you again.
Thank you all. Bye-bye now.